webcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first part of the Solar Photovoltaic Project Design and Development Series. My name is Andrew, and I'll be moderating. We will be starting here in a little bit, but before we begin, there are a few things to go over. Remember, it's very important to please be logged into the webinar through your own connection. This is required so that in the event that Half Moon Education or you are audited by a licensing board, that we're able to accurately prove your attendance. Also, it's the only way for you to gain access to the brief quiz at the end of the program, which is a requirement if you're trying to obtain your continuing ed credits. Next, I want to mention that to the right of your screen, you'll see a panel, and towards the bottom of this panel, you'll see a dark gray questions bar. If you double click this, it will open, and this will be how you'll be able to submit any questions you may have during the webinar. Please feel free to ask any questions at any time, and we'll be answering them as soon as we can. Lastly, if you should happen to lose sound through your computer speakers, there's an audio tab that's in that same panel, and you'll have the option to dial in with your phone. For anything else that might come up, please call Half Moon's customer service at 715-835-5900, and I'll post that number in the chat for everyone. With all that stuff being covered, I'd like to welcome our series speaker, J.R. Cromer.
All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this program. This is a solar program that I've taught in some form for over 10 years. And what it is supposed to be is the 6 hours of solar technical introductions that a building professional should know going into a project. So there's a lot of topics we need to consider, and there's a lot of advanced topics such as batteries that we just can't cover in as much professional detail as they warrant. But what this class should give you by the end of it is the ability to size up a rooftop and, just off the back of, off the cuff of your neck, you can perform solar performance estimates and be very comfortable with talking about, solar project design, payback, component selection. We're going to have a detailed introduction to solar in this. It's also a 6-hour program. So if you have questions, feel free to use the chat and talk, and we will make sure that your questions are covered. So there is a question already about receiving a recording after the session. I have a YouTube channel, and I take these recordings and then put them up to make them easy to access for you. So if you want a copy of the recording after the program, just send me an email and I will get it to you. So with that, let's go ahead and begin. I don't know if it's like that in all Half Moon programs, but this is, Half Moon and I have been working together for a long time. This is something I want you to do because I want you to do solar projects in a, more than you're currently doing as a result of taking this program. So my website is community.solar. I'm a mechanical engineer. I've passed the master electrician exam, the residential builder exam. I'm also a certified solar installer through a company that is like the American Institute of Architects for architects. NABCEP is a private certificate organization for solar. If you don't know where to go to in your local area for a solar installer, NABCEP is a good starting point, although, keep in mind they're a private certificate organization. In my experience, you also want to make sure that you're using licensed trade professionals as part of your project, such as an electrician to do the electrical work. And we'll talk about those concepts in class. But as far as finding a local solar pro to involve with your project, NABCEP is a great starting point. And before I got into solar, I worked in the oil and gas industry for Fluor Corporation doing control systems engineering and contract management. Okay, so the number one misunderstanding about solar power is everyone is so focused about how much energy a solar array will produce when there is a more important question to be asked, which is how much is that energy worth? And the reason why it's more important is because electricity price varies to a greater extent throughout the country than solar production. So yes, in California and in the Southwest desert where nobody lives, solar produces a lot more electricity than it does in Buffalo, New York. You compare the minimum and the maximum and kind of leave out Alaska, which is a special case. They still do solar in Alaska, by the way, because energy costs are so high. But even stateside, we got a lot of energy in the desert, not much energy up in the Great Lakes area, and that production will vary by about 50% on the extremes. Most of the United States, we hover right in the middle, and those are the numbers that we're going to be talking about in class today as far as production goes, kind of national averages. Electricity price varies much more across the country than 50%. If I go to Rhode Island, New York, I'd be paying 3 times as much for my electricity as I do on the Gulf Coast. And, that's a function of a lot of things, most of which we should not get into in this program. But on top of the raw cost of electricity, it then becomes how you are billed for electricity. And there are flat rate structures. There's variable rate structures, which I love because a variable rate structure, you can design the system to fit the rate structure and not, the roof or the electric bill, but say, what's the most bang for my buck? And with variability, you can find, optimization and have a more cost-effective project rather than a lot less cost-effective project. But lately, fixed fees have been going up, where the electric rates have been staying flat, but the amount of grid connection fees have been increasing. And so in one state, you might have very consumer-friendly buyback rates, and then another state, with a different power provider, the buyback rates are abysmal. And so throughout the country, as a function of policy and just more high-level energy pricing, you get into all different economic cases that have real economic impacts to projects in those areas, and that varies much more than the price of electricity. You might have a state that is heavily subsidizing their solar industry, and that results in deals that are, can be too good to be true. So you could have in Massachusetts a community solar program where you call a community solar provider, and just for a phone call, you start saving 10% off your electric bill because there's other powers that be that are really juicing the market, resulting in a very good payback for the developer. So the price of electricity, how much that solar production is worth, varies much more than solar production. And it's kind of, you multiply the two together to get your total project value. And what that means is you're going to have more projects kind of up in the northeast coast where electricity is very expensive, rather than kind of in the middle of the United States where you get really good sunshine and sunny weather, but you don't have as high of electric rate pricing. And generally, the cheaper the price of electricity is, the more scared they are to do consumer-oriented rates, because they're already looking at increasing their price of electricity, and they see on-site solar as one more source of revenue loss, whether it deserves that label or not. Let's look at budgets. It's very important to be able to break out project costs into budgets so that you know what you're getting yourself into. Um, Solar panels today, their price really hasn't moved much in the last few years, mainly because of import tariffs. And so 44 cents a watt is a pretty good budget for some, mid quality. And, when I say mid quality, I'm talking about good quality, just not the very top shelf. So there's a whole nother top shelf of solar panels that might cost twice as much as these. But we'll learn about my design aesthetic in class, and this is generally around what I pay when I'm implementing residential projects of all black monosilicon panels. Inverters. Inverter pricing can get cheaper than this, and sometimes that's warranted. Generally, when I'm buying inverters, I'm personally looking towards batteries, and so like this is the price of a solar inverter that might have some limited battery backup option, like the very popular grid-tied Solar Edge system. But a pure batteryless inverter you might be able to find for 25 cents a watt. I'm also including module level panel electronics called microinverters or DC optimizers, which have their own slides to come in this price range. And so what I'm saying is this is a inverter budget that is typical for a US household, where they're either having to buy, in the United States, we have to buy more expensive inverter systems because of National Electric Code requirements. And while that increases project costs, it also adds value to the project. We'll learn about that as part of the program. Solar racking is pretty cheap as far as roof-mounted racking systems go. At the commercial level, just from economies of scale, the racking cost can get under this. Although I would caution you, at the commercial level, you don't want to go with the low bid racking because there's other workmanship issues that a higher end racking system can address, such as cable management and pads, rubber pads for the racking system to sit on, as well as concrete blocks that might ballast the system down. There's a lot of required cost to a commercial racking system that might not be picked up if you're paying much less than this for your racking. Then we have kind of the direct labor budget and soft cost. Soft cost comes under attack in the solar industry for being such a large part of the project. But the fact is, there is a minimum amount of time that needs to go into, project development. And particularly because, whereas in other countries, there might be one power company for the whole country, so they can have a very streamlined, in Australia, for example, they say you don't need a permit to do a solar project. You can just go and put one on because they have more rigid power company regulations, for better or worse. It enables a system that way. United States, we were one of the first to markets with our electric grid, all right? So we have a patchwork quilt, and that makes it inherently a little bit more expensive to do project work in this area. On the flip side, when you have smaller electric grid distributor managers, even though that might lead to some higher red tape and increased costs, there is value in that. It's very easy to call someone up in the power company and get them out to site the next day if you're a contractor to pull a meter. There is some service that you get for spending a little bit more on costs that are normally associated with red tape. But my point is, this is what I would consider to be a decent project using, good enough panels, that I would consider to be high-end, except that I don't get into the more expensive, real high-end panels, the most efficient, the best looking, because, that's more of a luxury market to me. In high-priced real estate markets, absolutely, it can be worthwhile to go, for high-end panels. that's not the same philosophy you'd apply to an area where the price of electricity is cheap and the customer expects a payback. But I think this is a decent project cost. And there's some tricks to achieving a good solar project bid from a good contractor who knows what they're doing at this price range. Going through a competitive bid process helps. Doing the preliminary design work helps substantially. And another trick that I do is I buy by the pallet. So this is it's about 7.5 kilowatts of solar panels per pallet. So I'll commonly bid at like the 7.5 kW range or the 15 kW range or the 21 kW range because it's easier for a solar contractor to manage pallets of panels rather than one-off. Now, national pricing for solar is hovering a little over $3 a watt, and I was just showing you pricing for closer to $2.50 a watt. And there's a number of reasons for this. Some states have sales tax, others don't. That creates a 7%, 8% variability right there. Some states have higher price electricity markets, so you can charge more and the customer still gets a good payback. So why wouldn't you do a higher quality system and more difficult installs, things that cost more money, if you can still charge for it? Absolutely. And you can find those customers in markets where electricity is cheap, and sometimes those customers are doing it for reasons that have less to do with electrical savings and more about the kind of statement they want to make. Even so, project costs are high, and I blame building designers on this one. It is relatively simple to design and install a solar array compared to other project scope. And yes, that can get some people into trouble if they're a little green and they want to get into the industry for a new green job, but they find themselves doing electrical work when they're not electricians. You can get into workmanship issues. But at the same time, there's this knowledge barrier. This knowledge barrier is particularly humorous to me. When I was working at Fluor in the mid-2000s, Fluor was building some of the first solar dedicated silicon refineries in the world to help scale up the solar industry. And there's reasons that solar is growing, it has been growing, that do not have to do with green energy technology, mainly to do with continuing the growth of the silicon refining industry. And there's a ton of silicon in solar. It's just that for the past 40 years, making computer chips with silicon has been more profitable. Well, that industry has had its heyday, and now solar is the next growth opportunity. At any rate, what Fluor had to say about silicon projects is maybe it wasn't a good idea for them to be scaling up the solar industry because there are so few man hours in the design and development of a solar project compared to a traditional energy project that a company like Fluor, which makes its money by the billable man hour, could find themselves working themselves out of a job by scaling up the solar industry. And that was a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek comment made by whoever wrote this marketing analysis that I read. But I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. That means that building designers could be the new energy companies in terms of planning array layouts and getting solar projects put into projects. And I think that going through a traditional design, bid, build process is largely lacking in the solar industry because it has been so special. But connecting the dots to enable the already on-site electricians and roofers and general contractor to build the projects is a way to potentially reduce your project budget. Another way to reduce project budget is economies of scale. So the larger the solar project is, the less the soft cost of the industry is no longer a large part of your project, is now diminished. And so the utility scale solar industry has received a lot of attention for its growth and for being so much cheaper than residential solar. I don't think that paints the full picture, because after all, utility scale solar generates at a wholesale electric rate, whereas residential solar theoretically generates at a retail electric rate. So because rooftop solar has a higher generation rate than utility scale solar, it can support a higher installation cost than utility scale solar. And let's be honest, the utility scale solar market did not exist before the federal tax credit, whereas the rooftop solar market was already beginning to emerge. What I think is most humorous about today's marketplace is that the commercial solar market is the smallest market segment out of residential and utility scale. But before the tax credit, the commercial market was the largest solar market. And we get into, particularly in a discussion on batteries, the reasons why the commercial solar market has been suppressed over the last 10 years, and also the reasons why it's about to really explode in growth. And the reason is, when we're talking about solar today in class, solar lacks batteries. Most solar arrays today do not have batteries. They are simply electricity generating computers that you put on your rooftop and you plug them in, and you reduce your electric bill, and you sell back electricity to the grid. And when the grid's down, they go off, and when the grid comes back on, they go on. They're dumb devices. And the way that the commercial market has been billed for its electricity requires intelligence. It's variable pricing. And so now that batteries and digital load controllers are coming to market, there's a whole lot more you can do with a demand-based electric bill today that you couldn't do in years past. And so in the past 10 years, the residential market and the utility scale market have both had the right rate structures and the right subsidies to see some, accelerated growth, whereas the rate structure issue has really held back the non-residential solar market, the commercial solar market. But when you look at the commercial solar market, it's like, okay, well, we have similar soft costs to utility scale solar, nowhere near the soft cost as residential. But because we're on a rooftop, we have the ability to generate at retail pricing. And with variable rate structures, you have the ability to generate at above retail pricing. So I would not discount the commercial solar industry, even if right now residential solar and utility solar are in kind of a state of decline because the long-term impacts of the subsidy bubble, the accelerated growth is now, it's still growing, but it's decelerated growth. Whereas the major growth going on in the industry here and now is in commercial solar, particularly with batteries. And so what we're going to do today is give you the design steps needed so that you can generate a material list that is of sufficient detail so that you can confidently take it to a a material distributor. Okay. So, power. How much power does a solar array produce? Well, you look at a 1 kilowatt array, You say, okay, well that 1 kilowatt array, if it were energized for 1 hour, it would produce 1 kilowatt hour of electricity. And so, let's say you have 250 watt panels, and you have 1, 2, 3, 4 panels. That's a 1 kilowatt array, and if it's energized for 1 hour, it produces 1 kilowatt hour of electricity. That's like the starting point. But it's not completely true. The sun is at a different position in the sky every day. The temperature on a roof varies, and heat absolutely impacts performance. We're going to talk about those variables in a minute. And so you can't just say, oh, the sun's up for 10 hours a day, and I have a 1 kilowatt array, and so I'm going to produce 10 kilowatt hours. That's not how it happens. So we have a comment that says, I'm seeing overseas pricing more in the $1.50 a watt range. Why the difference compared to the U.S.? And it's exactly, solar, at the commercial level in the U.S. is hovering around $1.50 a watt. At the utility scale, there are bids going in at under $1 a watt. At residential, it's high. And that's because overseas, you don't go through a permitting process, which is more design and development. We are currently paying the import tariffs are rather substantial. I mean, we're talking about overseas. You're buying solar panels for 20 to 25 cents a watt, and we're paying 45 cents as part of a competitive bid process. So the import tariffs add cost. And then, in the U.S., you have to be an electrician, and there's a limited amount of money that you can pay an electrician to get up on a roof and do this work. So, I would say that the projects in the United States are held to a very high standard, and in other markets, the lack of the red tape does reduce the project cost. Okay, so let's get back into performance estimation. There's a website you can go to called PV Watts that will tell you how much energy the solar array will produce. So we're going to do a PV Watts example. What I like you to do as we're doing this example is and you can pull up the PV Watts website on your web browser if you like, but I like doing my designs for a 1 kilowatt array. I like to know how many kilowatt hours a year a 1 kilowatt array will produce, and then I'll just memorize that as a ratio. What 1 watt of solar, how much energy per year will it produce? And the reason why that number is so important is because then you can just mentally, even if you customize this number to your area, if you know this number, you can do off-the-cuff energy estimates. So we're going to do an example in a minute. But for instance, you could do, PV Watts does single axis tracking. So 1 watt of solar on a single axis tracker produces about 1.7 kilowatt hours per watt per year. 1 watt of rooftop solar produces about 1.4 kilowatt hours per year. So this is generally the ratio that I use for my mental math in the sunny south. If you're up east, you're going to be closer to 1 to 1.3. If you're in the southwest, you could be up at 1.6. But if I know this ratio for my area, if I know in my area 1 watt of solar produces 1.4 kilowatt hours per watt per year, if I'm sketching out a 5 kilowatt solar array, I can say, okay, 5 times 1.4, that's about 7,000 kilowatt hours per year. So as long as you know your ratio, you can, once you have that array size, if you're just bidding by the pallet, if you're saying, oh, it's a 100,000 watt. It's a 100 kilowatt commercial solar array. That's going to multiply that by 1.4, and you get your energy estimate. And so we're going to do a PV watts example. PV watts is tied into local weather data. So it's basing its energy estimate off of typical weather in your area. And you have to understand that typical weather is not the same as disaster weather. So if you're designing a off-grid home and you're using PV watts as your example, there might be a difference between, you might be thinking your design is really conservative because you're basing it off PV watts data and planning for X many days of storage. But if a hurricane rolls through, you might get more cloudy weather than typical. PV watts models typical local weather. Let's see. And what we're going to find with PV watts is that the tilt angle and orientation of the array doesn't matter quite as much as you think. So here we have a mostly south-facing array and a mostly east-facing array. And of course, the mostly south-facing array is the sunnier array, and that will be the best choice. Another option is the largest roof surfaces. Roof surfaces where you can fit a lot of panels make great mounting surfaces for solar, just from the ease of installation. This was an early project of ours, and if I was doing this project again, what I would do differently is this project, by the way, was very heavily subsidized by the city of Austin. They wrote this customer like a $48,000 check back in the day of solar subsidies. So, we were designing this array to kind of optimize the subsidy program. But knowing what I know now, looking back on this project, really, we have a choice if we're doing an array of this size to either have this array face south, east, but really east southeast, or use the other side of the roof and have the array face north west, really west northwest. So we can do east southeast or west northwest, but the relative difference between a east southeast facing array and a west southwest west facing array is relatively marginal. And so since you have higher air conditioning loads in the afternoon in Texas than you do, winter heating loads at, 9 in Texas, putting the array on this side of the roof, even though it would have had marginally less performance loss, would have been the better choice. But actually, the strategy is, can you cover up your entire roof with solar? And the reason I say that is the tilt angle and orientation, particularly with shallow tilt roofs, does not matter so much. If you have a shallow tilt roof and it is facing northwest or northeast, but it's only at a 5-degree tilt angle, the solar panel's really facing up rather than in any other direction. So let's take the ideal kind of condition in Austin, Texas, which is a south-facing array tilted up at the line of latitude. If we go to a southeast or a southwest configuration, you only lose 3% by going to southeast or going to southwest, which is not very much in the grand scheme of things. If at this 30-degree tilt angle you went all the way east or all the way west, you'd lose 15% or so. Again, not that big of a deal. And in fact, if you have a rooftop and you still have an electric bill, maybe an east-west facing roof would be better than just using the south portion of a roof. If you take an ideal tilt and you go down 10 degrees from it, or go down 20 degrees from it, you're only losing about 4% of your energy. If you go up 20 degrees, you're only losing about 6% of your energy. And so, yes, a steeper tilt does get you more power in the wintertime, but not much more. You also don't lose that much more power by going with a steep tilt or a shallow tilt. And so what that means is on a rooftop that's already slanted and already tilted, it's just not a good idea to tilt up off the roof. Just stay coplanar to the roof. It's the best structurally for the roof. It's the best for wind load, some structural and mechanical issues. It's also the cheapest and the easiest to install. And then, when you tilt up off the roof, you have to worry about inter-row shading, which is difficult to model at the very least. But the point is, going from south to southwest or south to southeast, all the way to due east, all the way to due west, you're not losing a ton of power. If you're tilting, flat versus don't worry about the tilt of your rooftop because the performance differences are marginal, and you can get all of this data and run these experiments yourself, within PV watts. So when I approach a rooftop, I'm not too concerned about what the ideal roof is. I'm looking for large open roof surfaces that preferably have a southern orientation of some degree, but if the surfaces are large enough, I'll do east and west. And if the roof is a shallow enough tilt, then there are cases where I would consider the north side of the roof if the client still had budget and still had an electric bill. Because it doesn't cost, if you're already filling up 3/4 of the roof with solar, to do the last quarter doesn't cost, a direct ratio. You start getting into economies of scale where buying a few more panels, moving on to the next roof surface, now that you've already overcome the site mobilization costs, making the array a little bit larger, even though that section might be a little bit less productive, can sometimes improve the project economics. What would a north-facing array do? Well, a north-facing array would really only be producing its electricity in the summertime. And, maybe if I'm up in Minnesota, I don't really care about my summertime electric bill. I'm not running the air conditioner. But if I'm down in Texas, that's when I'm running my air conditioner. So that additional, power boost in the summertime on the north side of the roof, in Texas, it can make sense. Whereas, in Minnesota, you'd have to use a little bit of common sense. And so PV Watts is a very easy to use interface. You get to the end and it tells you your performance estimate for your area. The mistake that installers make is they just stop at this PV Watt screen. But there's some incredibly valuable data. If you scroll down on the report screen, scroll all the way down, you're going to actually export the results into an Excel file. And the results are given on an hourly performance estimate basis rather than a monthly performance estimate. And that hourly data is incredibly useful. It'll tell you the temperature of the roof. It'll tell you how much sunlight's on the array, how much sunlight's coming off the array for every hour of the day, for every day of the year. So you can look at your peak power production of the array. You can look at what the array will produce on a cloudy day. You can look at how many days in a row of cloudy weather does PV watts predict. And PV watts data, this same data that you can download into Excel, is used by commercial solar design software when they do their 3D modeling for shade analysis or something more simple than that. So it's even though PV watts has a very simple interface, it has a whole lot of data behind it. And so I think it's useful to say, well, how hot does a rooftop actually get? You know, what kind of temperatures am I exposing my system to? And that becomes an electrical design issue because different conductors and different pieces of equipment have different temperature ratings. And so if you're looking for a temperature rated terminal box to put on the rooftop, you might not find it at your local electrical supply house. So how hot does it get in Phoenix, Arizona? Well, you know, it gets up to 160 degrees Fahrenheit on the roof. So why is that important? Well, the wattage rating of a solar panel. Back in that example, I was like, there's 4 solar panels, 250 watts each. It makes a 1 kilowatt array. The wattage rating on a solar panel is done at a standard test condition. It's called STC, standard test condition. And all of these data points that you find on the module specification sheet are done at a standard test condition of 25 degrees Celsius, which is 77 degrees Fahrenheit. And so at 77 degrees Fahrenheit, a 250 watt panel under full sun will produce 250 watts. But if you elevate the temperature of that panel, it'll start to have more resistance and its power rating will go down. And so we're talking about temperatures of 77 degrees Fahrenheit versus 160. You know, there's a lot of heat up on that rooftop in the summertime. How does temperature impact performance? Well, on your module spec sheet, there's a temperature coefficient of voltage, a temperature coefficient of current, and a temperature coefficient of power. And the temperature coefficient of voltage will tell you how voltage is impacted by temperature. And what we can see is that voltage is much more impacted by temperature than current. You know, almost an order of magnitude more than current. And so voltage is going to jump up and down because of temperature, whereas current, you know, there is some movement, but not much. And so on a warm day, voltage drops and current slightly increases as the temperature climbs. On a cold day, voltage increases and current decreases. And so, you know, if you on a hot summer day get a breaker that trips, you're in luck. It's probably that the breaker, which has overcurrent protection, has tripped because it was undersized, and your system meets its maximum current capacity at high noon, you know, on a full power day, slightly high. You know, voltage is on the other hand. You know, your peak voltage would occur on the coldest day of the year under full sun. And that can be problematic in areas if you've put too many modules, solar panels on a circuit. You could exceed the voltage requirements of the electronics they're connected to and then burn up or kind of pop the electronics. You know, current is more of a heat, more of a slow burn kind of thing. Voltage is more of a immediate explosion. You know, you fry your microchips, they don't work anymore. You bricked your inverter rather than burned it. The way you make sure you don't do that, there are rules in National Electric Code about overvoltage and overcurrent. the manufacturers have taken these rules and put them into sizing software, and so use manufacturer sizing tools. We'll get into that in the program. But the point is, the rated current, the rated amperage are different than the design current and design amperage. You have to, allow for more allowances than that. You're given operating voltage and operating current, which is what the panel's really producing, as opposed to its open circuit voltage or current. In code, we design around the open circuit parameters rather than the operating parameters, and you can tell they're a little bit more stringent. And that's because, hey, if your solar array is off on a cold day at high noon, it will see its maximum voltage at that time. But at any rate, let's focus for now on the temperature coefficient of power, which is a negative 0.4 per degree Celsius that the percent. And so for every degree Celsius that the cell temperature climbs above 25 degrees Celsius, the 250 watt panel will lose 0.4% of its power. And so if we see a 60 degrees Celsius temperature on the rooftop compared to 25C, that's a 35C difference. Times 0.4%, you're losing 15% of your electricity from the solar panel on a hot summer day in Phoenix, Arizona, just due to rooftop temperatures. And so every solar module is given this standard test condition to make things standardized, but it's not really indicative of field performance. And in the past, there's been other ratings to indicate field performance, but you can really just look at the spec sheet and look at the temperature coefficients of power to see which panels are going to perform better at higher heat, for example. This irradiance value of 1,000 watts per meter squared, that jumps around too. It increases at high noon when the sun is not going through as much atmosphere, and decreases throughout the day. And then there's the atmosphere itself, the haze, the humidity that can diffuse the light. And so at any rate, what we do in the design aspect is we look at these extremes and design off open circuit current, open circuit voltage, full power. But we go back to PV watts to see, what typical system performance will be like. So let's go ahead and do well, I guess we're still going along. So PV watts, it's good for sunny days, cloudy days, environmental conditions. I will take the PV watts data and use it as the starting point for off-grid modeling. You can use it for economic modeling as well. Although I generally, by the time I'm doing economic models, I'm either building them myself for kind of preliminary evaluation, but there's even really good quality commercial solar software out there for doing economic modeling, which I find to be a design tool because I like designing systems based off their value optimization. Let's do a PV watts example. Here's the PV watts main menu. And so again, what I like to do with PV watts is I like to put in a 1 kilowatt system into PV watts. Now, I'll just use standard solar panels, although this would change around those temperature coefficients. I do a standard array type, although it can do tracking arrays if you want. We're going to get into the system performance losses in a minute, but you can customize them here. And then I just, I might go and adjust the roof tilt. You can click on this roof information budget to convert roof tilts into degrees. So you can find out what the degree is for a 512 roof or a 1212 roof just by clicking on that button there. And then the azimuth is what way does the solar array face. south is 180 degrees. Getting into the system performance losses, and sorry if I butcher your name, Owais, but in addition to providing the course recordings, I also have, and you may have gotten it, a handout that has the text filled in. So sometimes the handout with the text is slightly different than the slides, but all the notes are filled in. There shouldn't be any major differences between the two. But what goes into the system loss factor? We got soiling. So this is the amount of dirt that accumulates on a solar array. And so that's very contentious, because what most solar installer schools train you is that you don't need to clean a solar array. And that is true of a dry rooftop in sunny California. Except if you're doing your solar array on a roof that is adjacent to a dirt road, you're going to get a lot of dirt kicked up in the air, and that dirt's going to land on the solar array, and it's going to stay there. Heavy pollinated area, you can get pollen on your solar array. And the reason why this isn't like a huge industry problem is solar panels can tolerate some dust and some pollen on their surface and still produce power, but you absolutely see an increase in power production of a few percentage points whenever you get up on the rooftop with some water and scrub your panel with some water and a cloth. You don't really want to use anything harsher than that. You don't want to eat away at the water sealing of the panel, but we're talking about grime that can come off with some hot water, maybe some very mild amount of soap, not much. And so PV Watts is accounting for 2% of your performance to be off by soiling. And so in the first year, if you're looking at your system production, you're like, oh man, I've really beat my PV Watts factor. You're going to see some performance drop down as the system goes along, and it's probably best to clean your panels thoroughly once every 5 years, and know that you might have to do that more if you're alongside a dirt road, which is a reason maybe to put the solar array on the ground rather than on the roof. A ground mount array will get more soiling than a roof mount array, but they are much easier to clean. Shading. So this one is a little misleading. Now, what PV Watts is doing in the Excel file, in that hourly data, is it's counting every single possible watt hour that could come out of the system without considering the minimum startup power requirements of the inverters. And so a little bit of morning sun and a little bit of evening sun is going to be clipped from the PV Watts data. And that is also something you shouldn't be modeling to begin with, because in the very early morning and the very late evening, even objects that you wouldn't think would be shading your house eventually, that shadow stretch as long as the sun begins to dip below the horizon. And so, I don't really, this 3% shading number is misleading, because this is the number you want for a pretty much unshaded solar array. And any more shading beyond that, you'd have to increase this number a little bit further. PV Watts is also not modeling any snow on the array, preventing the array from turning on. And so, if PV Watts is modeling the snowy weather, it's modeling the snow clouds coming through and blocking the sun. But if PV Watts shows a sunny day the next day and there's 2 feet of snow on your rooftop, that's another shortcoming of the model. And so you might have to discount this number. You might have to increase it if you are doing a solar array in Buffalo, New York. We're going to get into warranty in a minute, Doug. Mismatch. The solar panels themselves are a little bit irregular in terms of performance. The way they make silicon is they make a big old sheet or a big old cylinder of it. Here's the sheet down below. And then they slice it up. And so they cut little square cells into the sheet, and they cut little pepperoni slices off of the silicon, and the center cuts are more efficient than the edge cases. And that creates a slight variability in the silicon. And the reason why you have different wattages of different solar panels, this is rated for 270 watts, this is rated for 280 watts, and they come from the same manufacturer, is the manufacturer sorts these cells around before they test the panel and give it its rating in the factory. But even so, you're going to have as much variability between panels, as within the product line. And so, it's here is a case where PV Watts is being a little too conservative because it's saying, hey, there's a mismatch in modules, and the weaker solar panels are going to be dragging down the stronger solar panels. And the reason why this is too conservative of a number is because back in the day, you would get a plus or minus 2% tolerance on the modules. But nowadays, it's really just a plus 2% tolerance or plus 3% tolerance. And they're not, they're giving you the minimum wattage rating of what the module would test for in the lab and not anything less than that, which is a change from years past. And while that change has been on the market for some time, the default value of PV Watts has not changed. So PV Watts might be a little too conservative on snowfall. It might be a little too conservative on a lightly shaded rooftop. But it's being too harsh on mismatch. Wiring, this is voltage drop, and you generally design around a 2% voltage drop, but it's possible to use thicker gauge wire and to achieve more like a 1% voltage drop on your projects if you use larger wire gauge. Anything that's less than 1.5% voltage drop, you get into diminishing returns for higher gains. But at any rate, it is possible to gain a little bit of efficiency by using slightly larger wires. Every splice, every connection is going to take a little bit of power out of the system. That's not to say that there aren't perfectly good times and places to do splices and connections, but there's no way around that. Now we're getting into actual degradation of the panel in the field. So when you unbox it, it still has that new car smell. But there is a degradation, which we're going to explain in greater detail in a minute, called light-induced degradation. That's at 1.5%. And then there's another kind of, and then this nameplate rating is kind of the same as mismatch. I kind of group them all the same, where this 2% is too conservative now, especially with the use of DC optimizers or microinverters, which are required in the U.S. but not in other states, and that does add another 15 cents a watt to the inverter budget, as we saw earlier. But the advantage of having a control box behind every single panel on the rooftop is it really eliminates the mismatch and results from one panel being a different size than the other. So that boosts PV Watts calculation by about 3%. And then we have an age rating. And this, I don't know, I think it's kind of similar to the nameplate rating as well. But really what they're talking about in these factors is degradation that is not light-induced degradation, but is a different kind of degradation called potential-induced degradation. I think we have a slide on it in a minute. But so what they're saying is this, essentially the solar panels do lose capacity as the years go by. And it's not much capacity, and it's more in the first year than it is in the latter years until the tail end of their life. So there's like a year one step down and then gradual degradation towards the end of its life. We're going to talk about that in detail, which is why I'm kind of glazing over it now. Finally, we get to system availability, and this is, I don't know how I feel about system availability. I don't think it should be included in the performance estimate, although I understand why they're doing it. What they're saying is this is the performance loss associated with the system being offline when it should be online. So if there's a power outage at the grid goes down, the solar array turns off, the system's not available, the solar array's not doing anything. It's losing production. Or if there's a workmanship issue and there's it required the array to be de-energized and repaired, the array might be offline for 2 weeks out of the year if there's an inverter failure and it needs to be swapped, sometimes even more. And so 3% is saying that for 9 days a year, the solar array is going to be non-functional when it otherwise should. And if you are in a situation where you're averaging the solar array being offline for 9 days a year or more, you have other issues going on that have less to do with the solar panel and more to do with the quality of your grid or the quality of the installer. And, I say that from learning experience too. It's solar projects aren't perfect, but they should be installed with when they are installed with a high degree of workmanship, you should not have a cause for regular maintenance outside of battery banks or even broader or more complex systems. So we're still talking about solar modules for a while. We'll get into the warranty in a minute. Well, let's do some basic terminology here. Solar cells are wired together into modules. And so actually this has some overlap with batteries. Batteries you think of as cells, but by the time you wire the cells into a 48-volt battery bank, you call that the battery module. So solar is a series of cells wired into a solar module. We don't use the term panel because panel already represents something else in electric code. Your electric service panel, a battery panel, a solar panel could be the electrical service panel the system's tied into, and that gets confusing. So we try to call what you would think of as a solar panel in the industry, we try and call them solar modules. DC circuits are referred to as strings, and these circuits are typically 7 to 14 modules long, although that's a very rough number. It depends on the design and technology selected. Your manufacturer sizing software from inverters is commonly referred to as string sizing software. And we'll show you some examples of how to do that as part of this program. When I think about the size of a solar panel, essentially it's as large as what one person can pick up and walk around with on a rooftop. If the panels get much larger than that, then it's not really safe or easy to maneuver on a roof. And manufacturers certainly like to kind of press the lines of what is appropriately sized for safe work on a rooftop. And for the solar arrays that are not on a roof, there are even larger solar arrays panels that still one able-bodied worker in construction could pick up, that are slightly larger, slightly heavier, and also slightly more economic because of that. You can fit more cells on the same racking for very limited upgrade in the racking cost, squeezing out just a few more watts on your framework. But when I think about the size of a solar panel, it's about 3 1/3 feet wide by about 5 1/3 feet tall. So that what one person can kind of reach and grab their hands around and kind of see over the top of, even if they're picking the module up and slightly walking underneath it. It's a good thing I'm not an artist. But 3 1/3 feet wide, 5 1/3 feet tall. What's interesting about that is if we know, a panel is, about 17 square feet. And, we know that a typical panel today is about 300 watts. We never did a PV watts calculation, so I'm going to pull it up real quick. But what we're trying to calculate now is how many kilowatt hours per square foot does a solar panel produce. So we're going to go over to PV watts. I'm going to do our PV watts calculation. I'm just going to kind of really run through it pretty fast. I'm in Biloxi, Mississippi today. So here we are in Biloxi, and I can kind of see the So PV Watts is sometimes making some changes. It can be hard to get these weather stations to appear. But anyway, not delay it. There's our latitude and longitude. I've been in a 1 kilowatt solar array, on a it's called a 512 roof pitch, 22.6 degree angle. Facing south. I don't use PV Watts as an economic tool because it doesn't consider anything. Just use it for performance. And see, I'm at a 1 to 1.5 ratio. 1 watt produces 1.5 kilowatt hours a year. 1,000 watts produces 1,530 kilowatt hours a year. So coming back to the program, if I'm doing a 300 watt panel and I'm producing 1.5 kilowatt hours per watt per year, I'm producing 4,500 kilowatt hours. 450 kilowatt hours per year out of this panel. And this panel is, I'm just going to call it 20 square feet, even though it's less than that. And so we're looking at about a little over 20, about 22 kilowatt hours per square foot out of the panel, just because we know its wattage rating, which I'm just telling you is 300 watts, and we know its dimensions, which is 3 1/3 feet by 5 1/3 feet, and we know 1 watt in my area from PV Watts produces about 1.5 kilowatt hours a year. Now we can calculate how many kilowatt hours per square foot a solar panel will produce. And the reason why that number is interesting is most 1 and 2 story tall buildings consume far less than 22 kilowatt hours per square foot, closer to 7 or 8. And so what that means is that, if you cover a rooftop of a building with solar, solar can produce enough power to offset the electrical consumption of most 1 or 2 story buildings if they have an easy enough rooftop to put a solar array on. which I think is pretty phenomenal. I mean, that means if we have solar across the rooftop of a city, that could be the power plant. Not trying to comment on yet if that's cost effective or not, just technically it's capable. The solar panel, again, thinking about what one worker could pick up on a rooftop, and then they press the bounds a little bit. They weigh about 40 pounds. It's not a terrible idea to use 2 people to carry them on the rooftop. Generally, if you're passing them up a slanted roof, you're really not trying to walk around on a rooftop too much to begin with. Manufacturers know that this is an outdoor rated electrical equipment, so they are rating it to take hail damage. It's rated for 1-inch hail at 50 miles an hour. Just real quick, we got a question. So you use the ratio between the kilowatt hours for the area and the panel of the ratio of the watts per square foot on the roof. Yeah, what we were just doing is we're saying, okay, if we know this is 3 1/3 feet by 5 1/3 feet, so we know it's 17 square feet, and we know that 1 watt in my area produces 1.5 kilowatt hours per year. And then I'm just telling you that this is a typical solar panel for today, which is about 300 watts. So we're getting 450 kilowatt hours per year out of this 300 watt panel, and we know the square footage, so we divide it and we get about 22 kilowatt hours per square foot. Sorry for my chicken scratch. So solar panels are rated to take 1-inch hail at 50 miles an hour. That makes them stronger than most roofing materials. I have seen in Central Texas, which is, that and Oklahoma are the worst spots in the country for hail. I've seen a mother of all hailstorms roll through, the kind that immediately gets uploaded to YouTube because it's so incredible. I mean, car dealerships are tearing their clothes off in grief because every single car in the parking lot is smashed clear through, not just the front of the window glass, but the sunroof and the rear window and some side windows. I mean, the roofer contractors are throwing parties because they know they have 2 years of work ahead in doing roof replacements. That kind of just horrible, turning everything and every piece of metal into a golf ball in terms of dimples. That kind of hailstorm. It was incredible. We're talking about, baseball-sized hail here. Yes, that will hurt a solar array. I've seen a hail-damaged solar panel. We took the service call on it. Out of the 20 panels on the rooftop, 2 were hail-damaged and not working. That's not to say that array shouldn't be looked at over the years to come because, it's not like panels are bulletproof. You should not walk on them. They are fragile. And, the thing about them is, while they are rated for outdoor environments, which means they are very tough, that can mislead the installer into a false sense that they are bricks or concrete blocks or pieces of plywood, that you can be too rough with. So if you lean into a panel, if you walk on a panel, if you're shipping a crate of panels and you put stuff on top of it, those little impacts can shatter the glass, or if they don't shatter the glass, they can form little micro stresses in that silicon that could, not always, but could cause the array to fail a little bit earlier in its life. Which kind of brings us to our warranty discussion. So before we get into that, just one little technical thing. Most residential panels are referred to as 60-cell panels, and these are the ones that are 5 1/3 feet by 3 1/3 feet tall. Most utility panels are 72 cells. it's hard to see, but you can kind of see on this panel the individual cells, and it's 6 cells across and 10 cells down. That's 60. You count up the cells here, that's 72. The 72 cell panels just have 2 more rows of cells, 6 cells each, 12 cells total. 60 plus 12 gives you, 72. And so the utility scale panels are just taller and larger. They have slightly more voltage because there's more cells wired in series, and series voltage adds up. But you can use 72 cell panels on a residential rooftop. There's no rule against it. So if you're doing a ground mount, 72 cell panels are usually going to be a little bit more cost effective than 60. Now, I like 60 cell modules for rooftop purposes because the 72 cell panels are not designed to be on the roof. They're a little bit too tall. They're a little bit too heavy. Now, I know there's a slide on warranty in here, so we're going to come back to that. Let's keep learning a little bit more about panels. Module efficiency. This efficiency number coming off the back of the solar panel is what is the total amount of sunlight exposed to the surface of the panel versus how much gets outputted as efficiency. I think that's pretty good. Harvesting all of sunlight, getting 17% out of it as efficiency, and the higher end modules are getting into the 18, 19, 20% range. The top shelf is more like 20% on up. As far as the module technologies go, it's pretty much you want to do monosilicon, and polysilicon is fine too, often a little bit cheaper. Overseas they might be using less efficient panels that are a little bit cheaper. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, it's a great strategy. In the US, by the time you're paying all these soft costs, you might as well spend a little bit more and get slightly better than the global solar panel. And so most solar projects in the US are installed with monosilicon. It's considered to be the best. It has really good market share. And polycrystalline is just is more similar to monocrystalline. It's still silicon. They make sheets of it rather than cylinders of it. And then all the other kind of thin film technologies have pretty much made their way out of the market. I rarely see any amorphous silicon. Sometimes it's talked about being put on top of existing solar because it's kind of translucent, so to boost production. There is a U.S. manufacturer called First Solar that's the exception to the rule, and they make their own solar panels not using silicon. But actually, their materials are not as environmentally friendly as silicon, and so they're better put in a utility scale project rather than being up on a rooftop that could burn down and leach, bad metals into the ground. There is a manufacturer making copper, indium, gallium, selenium modules called Solar Frontier, but by and large, their competitors have exited the market. So silicon is pretty much where it's at. When I'm selecting solar panels, particularly for residential, I wouldn't care about this on a commercial site, but when I'm selecting residential panels, what's actually the most important thing to me personally is selecting all black panels. I don't really care who the manufacturer is, and that might be because I work in the industry, so I know that there's a dozen really good manufacturers out there, and they're all the same in terms of risk on whether one's going to make it or not. So I'm comfortable selecting any of their products and know that I'm getting a quality product. It's much more important, I think, to buy through reputable vendors like online distributors who might support you if something goes wrong with your order. As a small customer, you're not going to get manufacturer support anyway, and the warranty is really more indicative of product life. You're just simply put, you're not going to get a ton of support for a module warranty unless you're using, licensed installers who have been in the business for a while and will continue to be in the business for a while, or similarly with your distribution chain. And I say that not to say that, this is a terrible, murky, dark corner industry. What I'm trying to say is that, to me, the brand of panel is not the most important consideration. But the one thing that I do like in terms of upgrading my solar panels above and beyond what's the average offer is to get this all black panel. And within all black panels, there's a value range. The top shelf solar panels, the ones that are 80, 90 cents a watt, they'll have just a black sheet of glass on the panel surface. So it will, this looks like a black sheet of glass, but there's even some nuances and some racking systems and some panel manufacturers can even vanish these lines. Whereas this one's still a good manufacturer, but a little bit cheaper, and the grid lines are on the top. To me, when I walk away from a solar array, I don't notice these grid lines, and it's not worth the premium to get that modern all glass home visual aesthetic when the next best thing is substantially cheaper. So, what I do like about all black is that it never goes out of style. Otherwise you get these little white dots and you get aluminum sight lines. And there are some rooftops where this looks really good, namely like metal roofs that look like metal already. You put a bunch of metal on top of it, it looks perfectly natural. The all black panels seem to give the array an aesthetic edge. Now, we can see that this designer, they were going for something very impressive looking. And yes, it's up on a rooftop, but you go far away and then you turn around, you can still see up on that roof. So this array is visible from the street somewhere, whether it's the neighbor's backyard or the actual street. What you can tell is this panel right here was not supposed to be here. It was supposed to be right there. But what we can see is there's a all black plumbing vent. Just like that one, kind of like that one. And a plumbing vent in the way. So maybe with this designer, they did the design off a satellite image and didn't pick up that plumbing vent. Sometimes I like remote design. We're going to talk about remote design in the program. But it's still useful to get the customer to take out their cell phone camera and take a photograph on site of the rooftop so that you can pick up those things. Most customers have cell phones, they have cameras, they can send you a picture of what the roof looks like from the ground. But if you can imagine that solar panel on the left fitting in to this array, it would look really good. I don't think solar shingles look very good. Tesla's solar shingle is not available, so it is more of a theoretical product to discuss than something that is being installed in mass. And the solar shingles that are available, I don't know, as a retrofit, that does not do anything for me that an all black standard module would, except this would cost a lot more money. So these solar shingle companies, they are out there, but they do go out of business pretty often. There are frameless solar panel options that remove this metal module frame. So frameless panels are pretty interesting. I haven't really seen them on the U.S. market. They were starting to come before the import tariffs, but every kind of specialty solar module of any size kind of stopped coming to the U.S. market when that trade war was coming. Um, at any rate, some interesting things about a frameless solar panel is when we talk about panel degradation in a minute, there's fewer, metal on a roof has to be grounded. And so metal module frames are grounded into the racking. And you can get some electrons kind of leaking out of the system, not in any perceptible or measurable way. We're talking about electrons, not enough to generate a discernible current, that might leak from the cells into the metal and then out the grounding system, never to return. And so there's this type of degradation called potential induced degradation, where out of the box, the very first time the electrons are stretching out, and some of them get a little too excited, jump out of the frame, go down the grounding system. A frameless system has less degradation than a frame system because there's, the cells are all the more isolated. I would do frameless for visual aesthetics, and I don't think this is the necessarily the best application for it. In fact, I find frameless panels to be problematic, and the reason is they have a sheet of glass on top and also a sheet of glass underneath, and that makes them much more easy to break. And so all glass panels, I wouldn't use them in this manner. I'll show you an example of how I would use them, which is bifacial panels for architectural reasons. The bifacial panels, which are glass on top and glass on bottom, sometimes they come in a module frame, sometimes they don't. But what they allow for is the collection of sunlight on both sides of the panel, on the top and on the bottom. Well, how much more can you collect through a bifacial panel? Well, you can actually solve that by PV watts. PV watts will tell you how much power a solar array will produce on a very cloudy day. And the answer is, maybe 10 to 15% of what it would do on a sunny day. Now, there are cloudy days and there are completely overcast days where that's different. I'm talking about days where, it looks like it's going to thunderstorm outside, and the sky's all gray, stormy days, where it's still a little bit light outside. It's not completely dark. Well, that's what the underside of a solar panel is like. And so a bifacial panel should give a system, another 10% boost compared to their non-bifacial peers, but not when they're put directly above a roof surface, mainly because the spacing between the cells is so close together, but it's not cost effective to space them further apart, because then you're buying more not solar material for your buck. And so these bifacial panels make great architectural statements. This sunroom, this awning way, all that stuff's pretty cool. The fun where bifacial panels coming to market for economic reasons is in the tracking market. Because when you have a big field of panels and the panels are up in the air on trackers, that additional albedo effect of reflected sunlight becomes more into play. We got a couple of questions. We say, will the Tesla solar shingles be available, and would you be inclined to them? I probably would not be inclined to the Tesla solar shingles to begin with, even if I could just call up a distributor and purchase them. And the reason is they're just small. You're installing, dozens more of these things than one big solar array across the rooftop. So I think the Tesla solar shingle will kind of continue to be a luxury item. I don't see roofers messing with them because they're electrical products. I don't see solar installers other than luxury residential installers really trying to be involved with them. And some of that is the state of building design today. I mean, I think building integrated solar is very interesting and could potentially be cost effective, but I don't think it's the solar installer who's going to be the one to figure out this building integrated stuff. It's going to take more of a someone more knowledgeable in building framing and building design to really start putting these pieces together. And installers on building integrated stuff is going to be like, well, what's the R value of this going to be? You know, how is the temperature of the room underneath going to impact the temperature on top? It actually improves it. You know, being able to stabilize the temperature of any electronic will be in its net benefit. A lot of the ways solar panels degrade is because the integrity between the module frame and the module glass with thermal expansion and humidity starts to work its way apart. So, you know, I think there's some strong arguments to be made for building the roof out of solar. I don't think a solar installer is going to be the one to do that. Distribution, you know, where I go to get solar panels, it's the same way you can go, particularly if you're rolling up your sleeves and doing the design work yourself. I go to online distributors, and I'll go to multiple online distributors and sign up for their newsletters because they email out pricing that's cheaper, that's more like what their installer pricing is than what they'll list on their website. So if you know what that price is, and you can go to them and say, hey, I know you carry this item and have it in stock, and this item and have it in stock, and this item and have it in stock. You know, here's the material list. Can you quote me? You know, I have never found a distributor. I've even found a distributor who on their voicemail says, you know, we are not a residential distributor. If this is a residential one-off project, please go to this other company. You know, I've called up a distributor like that for a residential one-off project, but because I had my design done and my material list ready to go, I was able to make the sale. And in that case, it was really important because we were doing a retrofit project and needed to get an old solar panel for matching, and they were the only ones who had it, and they had it at a great price. So I had to bust open that barrier to access it. You know, the solar supply chain is easier to get into than other, you know, like the air conditioning industry, where you have to be a registered carrier, you know, installer to install that product. Okay, we've been at it an hour and a half. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a 15-minute break. When we come back, we're gonna just wrap up our module discussion with some insights on how a solar panel and the electrons in the panel actually work, and then we'll continue our component discussion into inverters and racking systems, moving on into design tomorrow. So let's take a 15-minute break. It is 12:30 Central Time, 1:30 Eastern. We'll take a 15-minute break, and we'll be back at a quarter till. So 15-minute break, and we'll come back in a few minutes. We're going to get going in about a minute and a half or so. Still have about a minute. All right. Welcome back. We had a question over the break about bifacial panels and will they really produce more being kind of straight up in the air? Yeah, that's a real interesting question. It gets into energy density, and what it boils down to is absolutely the more solar you have jam packed into a given surface area, the more energy harvest you're going to get out of it. It's just a matter of, is that more cost effective to have a whole bunch of solar panels finned straight up in the air, or just one panel flat on the surface underneath? How much more will you produce? That's kind of a crazy example, but for real life application, PV Watts is a great sanity checker. Let's say I'm designing a cabin in Denver, and I get it into my head that I'm not going to put all of the solar on the roof, but I want to hang a solar panel down the side of the building so that the snow will fall off of it first, and I can use that panel to heat the other snow off of the roof. Something that sounds like it makes sense, but you don't know if it's a real good idea or not. And another example would be in New York City, where you might have a building where you could put the solar array down the side of the building, but you don't have any room on the roof. So, what about a solar panel that's tilted all the way up 90 degrees? What would that look like? Well, PV Watts is great for that. So we can put in our 1 kilowatt array, using standard modules. And, in this case, it's going to be a fixed rack. And, same system losses and facing south, but we're just going to put the tilt right up at 90 degrees. Well, first, let's just do a standard 512 rooftop and look what it would be. Denver, Colorado, maybe not as sunny as Houston, but not as hot as Texas. And so, it's, they don't get as much heat degradation. They have a thinner atmosphere. All those things go into a little bit higher production figures. So they're at a 1 to 1.6 ratio for a standard array. Let's go in, if we didn't tilt them out at 22, if we went them just a flat straight up in the air, they're at 1 to 1.35. So some loss, but not a complete loss. Why don't we do well, we've already looked at those examples, so just for time, we're going to go up to a 90-degree tilt angle, due south. And look, that array is producing as much energy as a solar array in Fairbanks, Alaska, hanging down the wall in Denver. And so, I'm always fascinated with the obsession of having solar face in an ideal manner, because it's not like the solar designer is going to adjust the tilt of the roof. If you do, you're going to make a mistake, because as an installer, I would much rather have the roof be walkable and then maybe extend some panels down the side of the building than to have like a 65-degree tilt angle project. You know, the site access and walkability of the site is what makes a project cost cheap. So, you know, rather than orient the building to the solar array, you know, just admitting that, you know, the tilt angle and orientation really do not matter as much as having big open spaces to work with. Well, so anyway, you know, what's kind of interesting with this one that's 90 degrees down the side of the wall is let's just look at our winter production, 113 to 126, versus the summer, which is obviously much less. Maybe that's when you need your electricities in the winter. We'll go back to that kind of roof tilt, standard roof tilt. You know, really, we get slightly more production, 126 instead of 105 in January. So it's not like we're supercharging our winter electricity by putting the panel down the side of the building. Mostly what we're doing is just losing summertime electricity by going down the side of the building. Yeah, but what I guess I want you to take away is, while yes, a more productive array is almost always more cost effective than a less productive array, there are these weird edge case scenarios that you aren't crazy to consider. And one of them would be in a remote location, hanging some panels vertically to mitigate the impact of snow shedding. Especially if it's a remote location where on-site backup power or emergency power is desirable. So, feel a little confident to be creative with your solar panels. Often nowadays, the solar panel itself is not the most expensive part of the project. Back in the day, solar panels were $3 a watt. That's 10 years ago. Now they're 44 cents. Okay. So how does a solar panel work? It's all about the silicon. So silicon is a semiconductor, which means it'll conduct electricity sometimes, like when energized, but it won't conduct electricity when it's de-energized. So in a computer chip, that controls the ones and the zeros and allows computers to happen. In a solar panel, the sun comes up, and that's the source of the energy, and it lets the electrons flow through the panel, and it's a matter of tricking the electrons within the panel to kind of line up together. If you get all the electrons to organize themselves, so the sunlight is providing the engine, and now it's just a matter of getting all the electrons to line up together, that creates a voltage potential, and that creates the electricity that we're using. And so what happens is the electrons get knocked out of their position. It's a crystal structure. So it's supposed to be a solid, rigid lattice of electrons. But when sunlight hit photovoltaic crystal lattices, the electrons that are supposed to be in a defined position can get knocked out of the crystal lattice. And in reality, in the solar cell, that leaves behind a hole that wants to suck an electron into it. And so we got, the sunlight comes up, and now we got photons hitting electrons out of where they're supposed to be and creating holes on where they want to go to. Almost like how a magnet has a pole to it. Your empty solar cells are wanting to pull electrons, and it's only a matter of taking that surface and making it uneven. tilting the pool table, if you will, so that all the balls fall into all the holes, can we get a positive side and a negative side to the panel? So, the sunlight provides the energy for all it to happen, and chemicals do the rest. They take that photovoltaic surface, the silicon, and treat the top side of it and the bottom side of it in dissimilar elements, and that creates the disparity that causes the electrons to tend to move to one side and away from another side. So the sun comes up, the panel gets a positive and a negative, and the sun goes down, and everything kind of falls back into place. So in this case, it's like a battery that's fully charged, except it's fully charged when it has full sunlight, and then it has different power levels as well. And so in this analogy of the pool table, the degradation of panels makes a little more sense. Sometimes an electron jumps out of the pool table and drains down the ground, never to return, and that causes a long-term degradation in the panel, potential induced degradation. And it's actually, it's a little bit more of a serious problem than just one electron leaving, because generally when that happens, there's a gap in the panel where there's not supposed to be one, and slowly but surely molecules of water from humidity work their way in and start pushing the panel up from the silicon, and ultimately corroding the environmental seal of the panel. But often it might be an electrical fault in the panel itself that causes that unzipping, if you will. And so, an electrical fault inside the panel could lead to a gap that accelerates the fault to the edge of the panel, and we'll see what that looks like in a minute. These are very exaggerated faults. They're not like real electrical faults that cause building fires, and which are primarily due to bad design and workmanship. But these are more natural degradations of the panel that result in the thing not lasting forever. The panel has an end of its life. These are how slowly it breaks down with time. Either little air gaps getting into the panels and causing, the electron flow to be impeded with resistance, here's one that is kind of interesting. This is what's responsible for the sudden degradation of the panel in its first few months of system operation. So there is a burn-in period where the array loses 1 to 3% of its production. It's fascinating to see. I had a project where it was a commercial project built in stages, and we used the same panel and same manufacturer and same inverter for the stages, and you could just see the production difference, this degradation occur. It occurs particularly in hot and this is different. The PID degradation occurs particularly in hot and humid areas where the moisture can better leak into the panel, and where you get the thermal expansion from the heat. So there's really not too much you can do about that. Solar is going to be installed in a lot of hot and humid areas, and manufacturers have kind of adjusted their designs to make the cells be a little bit further away from the frames and focus. This is why you go with a quality manufacturer, to get good build quality, to not have much PID degradation. LID degradation is the felt on the pool table. This one, it's a very tough problem to figure out. There's always some university studies that come out that say, oh, if we do this or that, we can eliminate LID degradation, but it nonetheless continues to exist in the field. Basically, a silicon cell is like new pool table felt. But when the electrons get knocked around by the sun and sucked into these holes, and they're bouncing into each other and bouncing off the sides of the cell, and tops of the cell and bottoms of the cell, they're etching channels into the silicon that eventually the electrons that are bouncing around, almost like the gutters on a bowling alley, the electrons will fall into these channels and lose a little bit of their momentum as they do. And so that momentum loss is Lig degradation, and it's just natural, occurring with any kind of flow, whether they be, water working its way through the Grand Canyon or electrons careening around on a silicon surface. And what it does is it just causes the combination of LID and PID causes a immediate step down of a couple percent, and then a long-term step down of about 0.5% a year. And so solar modules, the warranties are actually quite conservative. You should be getting decades out of them. It's just that, by the time a solar array is 15 years old, maybe I see it at 10 years old, the owner usually wants a different one. And that might be because the previous owner got such a heavily subsidized project that they don't care about the payback anymore. They just want something that looks better. The solar workmanship definitely has improved over the last decade. But there's no reason why the panels themselves can't keep on working. It's more like new panels are so cheap today that you would be hard pressed to come up with a reason to buy a used panel unless you were getting a really good deal on it. So for the warranties, it's a 25-year warranty. There are a couple of different warranties. A very standard one is a 10-year warranty at 90%, and then a 25-year warranty at 80%. And so what that's saying is we're going to warrant 10% loss. If you go beyond a 10% loss in the first 10 years, it'll trigger the warranty. And then it becomes if you lose more than 20% before year 25, it'll trigger the warranty. Now, I've never had a warranty issue yet involving this specific kind of degradation. And some manufacturers, instead of giving you this kind of stair-step warranty, they're going to give you a year by year by year by year by year warranty where they define that step down in year one, and usually it's around 3%. And then they define the remainder step downs, and usually it's around 0.7%. And these are all still very conservative. The manufacturer is not in the interest of buying you a new solar array. And so, by the time you get to year 25, you should expect, 80% of the system capacity to be in place at year 25. And the better manufacturers will give you a more defined warranty, and the cheaper or worse manufacturers or smaller manufacturers will just give you the stair-step warranty. And so the warranties can be indicative of quality, but within the industry at large, a 25-year life, whether it be a mid-shelf panel or a top-shelf panel, is what's to be expected. And furthermore, as I was hinting at earlier, whenever I have a module warranty issue, it hasn't been because it was degrading too fast by a small percentage. It's been something more substantial, like only getting 2/3 the value out of the panel and not in full. And usually that kind of issue is discovered right out of the box. And so it can be immediately addressed by, calling up the distributor and see what the distributor has to say. And usually at that point, it's taken care of, provided there's nothing else that was wrong with it. And, that's a rare, 1 to 2% or less issue. that even the industry itself doesn't really come down as to whether or not that's a shipping and handling issue or not. Usually the shipping and handling issues are what's more common, where you get busted solar panels arriving on site, and that's a very obvious thing to pick out. So, out of all of the warranties in the industry, the solar panel warranty is the one that I worry about the least, because panels are cheap and reliable. The other equipment warranties, like the inverter components in particular, that's the warranty that is used the most often, and that's the one, if you only have a fixed budget and you have to choose between getting a really good inverter or solar panel or racking system, the inverter is the good one to spend top dollar on. You can get really great mid-range racking systems and mid-range panels, but you don't want to, and sometimes code does not allow you to cheap out on the inverter systems. Okay, kind of one. Okay, so here's some module failures, and now we should be able to understand which is which. So this failure on the right is a shipping issue where a package is put down of heavy weight on the very top module on a pallet of modules, and that is not good for it. That can break it. So you need to make sure you're giving your solar panels a good visual inspection as the shipments arrive. And that's another reason to do projects by the pallet, is so that you don't have to unpack the pallets and even do shipment to site if that suits your business size. This failure here is a glass on glass thin film. And the reason why it's so much more dramatic looking is thin film is at a higher voltage than silicon. So this module probably has twice the voltage as this one, and there's a little impurity that got in between the glass and the cell, and that whether it's water and it's being vaporized by this voltage of the panel or whatever, but it's spread out. And the problem with something like this is potentially, this could be a problem or it could not be a problem. It's really about how much blockage of the cell current occurred. And it might be that the electrons can go around this sort of blockage, and sometimes they can't. So the location of these snail trails is really important. If you start to see these things between the bus bars, that's okay, because the current can still get to the bus bars. So you can have these kind of lines going up and down your solar panel, and you're like, what on earth are those things? And they're faults in your solar cells, but they might not be causing any production loss. They're not unsafe. It's just those were where micro cracks are put onto the cell, or a poor manufacturer build quality. You could go all the way back to the manufacturer. So it's a very difficult, poorly understood fault in the solar industry, that sometimes doesn't matter to the end user at all, because it doesn't trigger the warranty, because it doesn't trigger any performance loss. But if you get a fault occurring all the way across a cell and then isolating this silicon from getting to where the current flows into, you would lose that much voltage off of your cell, and that could be problematic by basically ripping a corner off of every solar panel tied into that circuit. So at any rate, something like this would even be dramatic, but not enough to trigger even a step down warranty. And as far as I can tell, this kind of discoloration called Snail Trails is kind of a crapshoot. Hot, humid areas, you can expect them more. That's more of a solar geek problem. It's not a huge industry problem. You know, you should be much more concerned about who your contractor is than whether or not your solar panels will get snail trails. And then one kind of like, don't do it if you have the option not to, is to not have solar panels be flat facing straight up in the air. And the reason behind that is the water's moving up, um, the water falling on the flat module surface, it can't drain. If it can't drain, it's going to evaporate. If it evaporates, it's going to leave behind whatever sediment was in the rainwater. So, and furthermore, that the rainwater itself could be, you know, right around the module seal, and so you don't want pools of water on top of your panels. You want that water to drain. So, you know, always give your solar panel a good you know, I even if for whatever reason you determine that the modules should go flat, you know, try and get them a 5-degree tilt. But I really like tilts that are even steeper than that, like on a flat roof where you're doing a commercial install. You know, I wouldn't tilt all the way up to ideal tilt angle. That's too much. You know, the shadows cast from the panels will take up too much space. But even still, going with a 10 or a 15-degree tilt is good, and you'll still get gunk and accumulation on a 10-degree tilt. You know, so you know, on a residential roof at a steeper tilt, you might get less gunk on the panel because you have a more vigorous runoff than your rainwater runoff plan on your flat solar panel on your rooftop. Spec sheets. Panels are rated for dead load and dynamic load on the top side and from underneath. Hail ratings are listed on the spec sheets often. You know, here's our positive plus or minus power tolerance. Here's a warranty that's being defined as 0.7% per year. These are all spec sheet items. You know, this manufacturer says, look, we've thought about PID and incorporated it into our module, and that's reflected in having a good warranty. You know, we're safe on farms where you can get a saltwater test or a corrosive environment test. In a truly corrosive environment, that's when you'd want to use a glass on glass panel, you know, so there's no metal to corrode. So that take that. And then we have options for different module frames. Here's a thinner frame and here's a thicker frame. In a hurricane zone, you know, you'd want to use the thicker frame. If you're doing something creative with your racking, you'd probably want to use a thicker framed modules. You know, it's modules back in the day had thick frames, and you could throw them in the back of your pickup truck and drive down the road with them. What I've seen as like a trend over the last 10 years is manufacturers trying to cut out or eliminate material within the solar frame itself, making them thinner, taking out certain material from non-critical parts of the frame, and sometimes that has an impact on whether or not you can mount the modules in portrait and landscape. So there are sometimes advantages of thicker framed modules, but the general practice is to go with just a standard thin frame, about 30 to 40 millimeters. So we got our first mention of PV wire as the output cable. And look, these output cables from the panels themselves are number 12, but most in the solar industry are going to step up at that point into number 10, sometimes number 8 to transition home. Module spec sheet items give you the dimensions of pretty much everything on the spec sheet. This is useful for a variety of planning purposes. And then here's the most important warranty item. So we probably got all comfortable thinking 25-year warranty, and that sounds good. So this is where the top tier panel makers and where I usually go, which is the mid shelf, do differentiate. Many mid tier, and I would not define mid tier by manufacturer. I would define mid tier by price, because even the same manufacturer can have a top shelf and a mid range module. So at any rate, a cheaper solar panel, new, with a 25-year performance warranty may actually only have a 10-year limited product warranty, where they say, you know what, at the end of 10 years, we're actually not going to honor our warranty at all, because we've defined what the power level is from the year 1 to year 25, and at year 10 you've been tracking way above that product, that power level, and so anything after year 10, that is, we're going to assume, and you're going to have to come back to us and prove it, that it's not a workmanship issue. So at year 11, if the panel's been working perfectly fine from year 1 to year 10, and then the panel all of a sudden stops working, the manufacturer's going to say there's something that went on with your site, not something that magically happened to our panel at year 11. It stops producing power when nothing else like that has ever occurred before. Usually when there's solar panel recalls, they percolate through the industry pretty quickly. You wouldn't have a dramatic event like that occurring and it be a manufacturer default at year 11. And so just be aware that the performance warranty is more of a performance indicator than anything else. If your panel drops below 90% at year 6, and you have that stair-step warranty, the manufacturer may come back to you and say, well, here's a check for the pennies difference in lost production that you've lost on that one solar panel. But before it's eligible for the warranty, we want you to do all this kind of thermal testing and IV testing, because it's going to be real costly for us to initiate our take-back process. And that's, again, conversations you really only get into with commercial projects where you're working directly with the manufacturer. Otherwise, having a good distributor goes a long way. But most of the actual warranties on the build quality of the module itself, will the solar panels stay together physically? That's only for 10 years. It's not that the panel won't stay together physically for 25 years, but the manufacturer is only putting themselves on the hook for 10 years of it. Because that module could be taken apart and put back together, as far as putting it on the roof, taking it off the roof, putting it on the roof. And so, they're saying that you're going to be a little bit responsible. Now, if you put that solar array on that roof and it doesn't move for 25 years and you're collecting all sorts of data, and then at year 20, the production starts to go south and we recognize it's a cell performance issue, that's when we'll honor the warranty. But if you, take our panel and you put it through 3.5 hurricanes and, 2 roof rebuilds at year 15, and we don't see it going through this dramatic performance loss curve that occurs slowly over time, but we see something more random and inexplicable, that's where the product warranty triggers. And the top shelf manufacturers do offer 25-year warranties on their panel, and the price difference between the mid shelf and the top shelf, very well might be the value of that warranty. And so it's really kind of up to you at that point on, do you add another year or two onto your project payback and go with a longer warranty item, or stick with something cheaper? And it could completely depend on the client and the job site on what's the best choice. In my experience, rooftops which are not easy to access should be treated with a longer term perspective than rooftops where you can easily get up on the roof and back down again. Okay, so we talked about designing by the pallet. You know, on spec sheets, you can get pallet quantities, you can get shipping container quantities. Manufacturers will have their warranties listed. So we talked about the performance warranties, so I'm just trying to move us ahead. Solar panels have bypass diodes built into them. And so if something were to go wrong, you know, right out of the box with a panel, and this is where on the flip side, I've seen module manufacturer warranties cover things that may or may not have been their fault. You know, so if one cell goes bad on a module out of the first year or two, you know, that could have easily been a solar installer putting an elbow or a knee on a solar panel and it not causing a break of the glass, but more of a imperceptible micro crack that puts more resistance into a cell. And so what happens in that case is it takes the bypass circuit out, and all of a sudden the solar panel is producing about 2/3 if there's 3 bypass diodes, or 20% less if there's 5 of them, or 25% less if there's 4 of them. But whenever there's like a very precise, like, all of my panels are producing this much power, but this one panel is producing exactly 3/4 less or exactly 2/3 less, it's a bypass diode issue. There's a cell that's been wrong, and I've had no problem using regular solar distributors where if an issue like this is caught within the first year of the project, getting that module replaced under the manufacturer warranty. So the moral of the story is, treat the surface of the solar panel with respect. When you're handling a solar panel, you should really just be moving it on the frame. Panels are big, and sometimes you have to slide them across the surface rather than be able to grab them and lift them up in the air. And if you're sliding a panel across the surface, like sliding a panel off of a pallet, you always want to make sure you're just impacting the module frame itself and not, the surface of the glass. So even if you're sliding a panel, make sure you're staying off the surface of the glass. Don't put things on top of the glass. It's really the frame of the panel that gives it its strength. The glass on glass panels really shatter until they're mounted on a racking system. And once they're on that rack, they have more support underneath. And so as an engineer, I love this stuff, looking up a solar array and looking at mounting clip zones and seeing how I have different wind ratings and different load ratings based on how I choose to attach the panel to a particular racking system. And so there's even configurations for the same panel and the same racking system, but with stronger loads by putting additional reinforcement on. And so, it might not be for planning in a hurricane zone. It might not be a matter of buying a different solar panel, but instead, just buying some more racking and adding some more reinforcement to it. Likewise, mounting to the corners of the panel may enable a landscape mount, whereas, otherwise you might be mounting in a portrait mount. And so generally, panels can be mounted in both portrait and landscape, but it never hurts to check first because, it is a competitive market, and panels that have less framing built into them have less inherent strength and may not be able to support all kinds of mounting configurations. And then here's a weird mounting configuration that unfortunately, I've been getting into situations where I need to use it because of spacing of the rafters on the rooftop or spacing of the support structure underneath. Um, I just did a solar pergola project where the contractor had started construction without the design done, and then he had to figure out how to get the panels on top to fit, and we had to do a shared rail design to get the spacing right. But this is where normally rails underneath a panel are just about 8 to 12 inches in from the top of the panel on either side. You're just using two rails going across the roof. In the US, we mount a lot in portrait because we have rafters going up the roof, and so we can mount our rail going across the roof and anchor onto the rafters, and then the modules follow. In Australia, they do a lot of landscape mounting, and they do a lot of metal roofs, and often you'll get purlins going across the roof rather than rafters. And so the rail, it makes it easy for the rail to go up and down the roof rather than across the roof. And so you get into a landscape configuration. So the roof truss or rafters or purlins, that really drives the default orientation of whether or not you mount in portrait or landscape. But then it may be a simple matter of just buying additional rail to enable a landscape mount, which often looks better than a portrait. I like portrait because it's cheap and it's easy, and that's kind of the default for rafters that go up and down the rooftop. But that doesn't mean you can't do other configurations. And then in California, where they're doing solar all the time, what's popular by installers is Rayless Systems. And Rayless Systems are interesting. I don't like them as much. And the reason is any rail gives you the ability to level the rail. And so if the roof is wavy, the rail has a little bit of give in these attachment points, and it lets you fix that. And, solar panels are very rigid rectangles. So if they go on a wavy surface, they can look wavy from the ground. And so the rail does a lot. It helps you stabilize the modules. It lets you mount the modules. It gets the modules a little bit further up off the roof for a little bit better airflow and heat dissipation. And the rail is not expensive. But there are contractors who use railless panels because it's cheaper. And sometimes there are instances where railless panels are better. Let me give you an example we just looked at. This is funny. I know that they probably regret this photo because there's a problem with racks where they have standing seams going on a standing seam metal rooftop, which is that the standing seam panel gets clipped to the roof deck as it's being put on and built across the roof. So each one of these metal, 16-inch wide channels is clipped. But the spacing for these attachments are now skipping across channels. And so because this standing seam metal rooftop is it's the solar array is attaching to the metal panel. It's not traditionally, it would be lag screwing into the rafter, which is over engineered. It's super strong. There's decking. The next picture we're showing, you're just screwing into the decking, and the decking can be strong enough to hold solar onto the roof if you use enough attachment points. I like going into the rafters. Most installers like going into the rafters. Later we'll show you how to do this technical analysis. But the problem is if you're skipping over these roofing panels, and these roofing panels are only just so rated to hold themselves on the roof, and then you're putting 3 times as much uplift as what you would have done if you're going onto every single seam, and then you can compound it with the rail effect, where the force from the whole rail can go into the equation for prying up a weak attachment point. And so the thing that is that you need to keep in mind when you're doing a railless system is that you should be attaching putting a lot of attachments per panel. Railless has more attachment points. That means there's less force on each panel, and there could be some rooftops where the roof, how you're attaching, cannot take the force of a traditional array. And so the mistake on this standing seam picture here is that if you go and read the manufacturer documentation, they're going to be telling you to hit every single seam with an attachment as you go across from it. And then on top of that, getting rid of the rail is a way to take less stress on those attachment points. So when I do standing seam rooftops, I do railless racking. If I had a rooftop where the shingles are so cheap, I'm in Mississippi. I'm not opposed to putting solar on a trailer home, but there's some shingle rooftops on a trailer home where it's like, look, this is a cheap roof. It's always going to be a cheap roof. There's some ways where solar can add value to a cheap roof, but prying up the shingles and putting flashing under the shingles on some very, very cheap shingle roofing is not an option. And so at that point, you would have to do an above the shingle racking solution. So railless is kind of a weird thing. Some contractors do it because it's slightly cheaper. Sometimes I do it because for a particular roof where you need a lot of distributed attachments, it's better for loading. And then there's some rooftops, because of the shingles, you really have to stay on top. And at that point, it gives you the most waterproof you can, which is, they claim that it's more waterproof than a traditional flashing system. And I'm not sure really, I don't really have an opinion one way or the other if it's better or not. So let's kind of move into a design discussion. Planning your array layout, what you really want is a big open space, but the name of the game is how many rectangles can you fit into the area. With some concern for aesthetics and fire code and building code, and we'll be talking about that. The kind of advanced note is people put a lot of concern about putting holes in roofs and the solar array causing the leak. What started to leak after this project were the sunroofs. Not the drilling of all the holes, underneath this array into the roof for all the attachment points and everything like that. That's brand new attachments made by licensed tradesmen who, they're inspecting each little hole they make. What began to leak is the stuff that's already on the roof, that's already 10 to 15 years old. And what happens is wherever there's not panels on the rooftop, like leaving this clearance around the skylight, well, the clearance around the skylight during construction becomes a walkway. And so you have workers kind of tromping up and down around this skylight. That then then the skylight begins to leak, that shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. So, kind of the concern with roof leaks is taking care when you're on the roof to be aware of all the other pre-existing obstacles. Those are the problem areas with roof leaks. And eventually what we did with this project is took out the skylights and just made a more aesthetically pleasant solar array. Easy enough. Yeah, we'll talk about racking systems on ballasted on flat roofs. I have some pearls of wisdom on commercial racking to talk about. Shade analysis. It used to be back in the day we would get up on the rooftop and take this exact device, and what it would do is you'd map out where the tree is and where the house is, and this chart underneath would give you hours of the day and months of the year. This is called the Solar Pathfinder, by the way. And it's still a good device for doing exactly this. I mean, it gives you what you stand right here and you can say, okay, the sun in the summertime, it's going to come up and hit my array. It's going to take until 8:30 for the sun to come up. But then I'm free and clear the rest of the day. And actually, this house here is not really a big issue because by the time it starts shading my array, that's going to be 9 a.m., but it's going to be, in the winter half of the year, and so the days are already going to be shorter. I'm not going to get much sunlight until 9 on the array anyway. PV watts doesn't show my solar array turning on until 9, so I don't have to be worried in the wintertime about stuff before that. And really, maybe it's this tree right here that could be turning off my solar array at 2:15 that I need to be worried about. And there's even charts where you can use these numbers underneath, or you can find the process online where you can take that section of the tree and convert that into a percentage. So there's maps where each of these numbers represents a percentage loss of production. And so you could say, okay, well, I'm losing an additional 1.5% because of that tree. That's a lot of work. Get up on the roof, walk every inch of it, make an accurate map, trusting on this little compass. Certainly a lot of design can be done remotely through satellite imagery, and there's services you can pay to get better satellite photos. I usually will just check out Bing, which is a competitor to Google. Bing is Microsoft's map, and sometimes they have much better photos, particularly in rural areas. And there's commercial design software incorporating satellite imagery as well. I still think there's nothing better than getting the client just to walk a few feet away from their house, turn around and snap a photo so that you can actually see what's on the roof. So that if you have a particularly blurry overhead image, you can better understand what's a smudge versus what's a vent. And let's see, I'm tracking y'all's questions, but I'm still not there yet. When I was just doing residential projects, I thought that commercial site evaluations would be harder than residential, but they're actually easier because there's usually not a shading issue that can't be solved with good old-fashioned trigonometry. On a commercial site, how tall is the air conditioner unit standing off the roof? Oh, you need to be so many feet back. Well, actually, on a commercial roof, if there's any kind of elevated anything like a building wall or a piece of electrical equipment or a vent, you want to be pretty far away from it to begin with. So commercial layouts are actually a little bit easier. You know, what's interesting is with Google Earth, you can actually determine tree height. Tree height's the hardest thing to figure out. But if you know the length of the shadow, Google Earth down in the corner here will give you the day that the image was taken. And it'll give you on its ruler tool the heading of the what you're tracing out. And so I have the length of the shadow, I have its azimuth, and I have the day that the shadow was measured. So if I want to know how tall that tree is, I can go online. There's these are called sun angle azimuth charts, but they tell you where the sun is at all hours of the day. The Navy makes a very good one. Put in your city, and you put in the day that the photo was taken. And it says, okay, well, at the shadow was measured to be at a 160-degree bearing, and so when the sun was at 160 degrees, the photo was taken at 10:30 a.m. and the sun was 27 degrees up in the sky. And so if I know how high the sun is, and I know the length of the shadow, and I know the angle of elevation of the height, I can calculate the tree height. And so just with Google Earth and trigonometry, you can do crude shade analysis. How tall is that tree? And the reason why it doesn't need to be anything more than crude is presumably the tree is going to grow over time. So not only do you need to estimate how tall the tree is now, but where the tree might be, 10 years from now. And there's, when I do my shade analysis now, I've moved on to commercial software. So this one's Aurora Solar, and they're very good at putting the LiDAR data directly into the model. They're not the only ones who do this. Helioscope does it as well. But I think Aurora has a little bit better of a graphical interface for visualization. To be fair to their competitor, some say that Helioscope is quicker and easier to use as a sketch and layout tool. But regardless, what we can see here is that the roof has been modeled and the trees have been simulated to be taller than what they currently are to project future tree growth. And so I like doing 3D modeling with commercial software to do an exact shade analysis. And I think this is actually more accurate than going on site and doing your own shade analysis because it's exact. Whereas even with the Solar Pathfinder, there's still things that you have to assume beyond that data, such as tree growth, to perform an accurate model. So we're still talking about planning the array layout. Wind speed is greatest at the corners of a building and then the edges of a building. And so there's zones for wind speed that in some racking sizing tools, they'll tell you, if you go into this zone, if you put your solar array at the corner of the building, it'll be subject to this much wind load. If you put it all the way up to the edge of the building, it'll be subject to this much wind load. And in the interior of the roof, it'll be subject to that much wind load. And that's another thing to keep in mind with the design work. The solar panels, regardless of where you put them on the roof, the ones at the corners will experience the most wind load. The ones at the edges will experience the second most wind load. And then the ones in the middle will experience the least. And that gets into how you apply the concrete ballast blocks to weight down the array on a commercial rooftop. If you want to use the least number of attachments possible on a residential rooftop, how do you stagger and distribute those attachments to best support the rooftop? And the answer is you want to support the corners and the edges more than you would the interior of the array. And on top of that, staying to the interior of the roof surface will subject the roof and the array to less wind load than the corners. Not to say you can't go to the corners or the edges, but to understand that if you're designing the racking system and you're going all the way to the edge or all the way to the corner and you're not doing anything different with your roof attachments in those locations, you might want to give it a second look to make sure your spacings are correct. And we'll show you some racking software that is how you do this for a particular product. I see your questions. I'm just kind of moving on this, and then we'll get back to them at the end of this section. But the fire departments also require setbacks from the edges of the rooftop. So there's more than one reason to set back from the edges of the roof. And for me, as the installer, I want the array to be set back from the edge of the roof just so I can get up there and work on it if I ever need to for any reason. It couldn't be that there's something that isn't installer error that requires fixing. And if it involves renting construction equipment and a lift and making a big ordeal about getting up onto the rooftop, that can be quite pricey. If you can get a ladder up there, you can safely climb up onto the rooftop, service and maintenance might not be that big of a deal. Now, fire departments, they want it because they want an area where they can cut a hole in the roof to ventilate the smoke out of the building. And what that's resulted in is a standard that's part of International Building Code. It's not always enforced at the United States residential level. Some jurisdictions, it's mandated. Other jurisdictions, they say, you know what, our firemen aren't getting up on the roof anyway, so have at it. So, and actually, this policy could completely come down to who's the fire chief or if the building is getting proper oversight or inspection. But building designers should know that, yes, this is actually part of international residential code to have the 3 feet off the sides, 3 feet off the top. It's actually, I think it's not a bad idea to have the array go down to the edge of the roof and not do 3 feet off the bottom. The reason I think that's a good idea is rainwater runoff. You want to position the modules, just off the edge of the rooftop, not slightly overhanging, but kind of right in line, so that when you get torrential rain, it doesn't skip over the gutter, but it falls into the gutter. So, if you ended the array further up off the roof, but it was a sizable solar array on a long roof, you might get a whole bunch of rainfall hitting, the actual shingle and eroding the shingle. So, I think it's prudent to start your array right at the bottom of the rooftop and then work your design up as far up as you can go while maintaining 3 feet off the sides and 3 feet off the top for access. And furthermore, 3 feet is not as big as 4 feet. I feel much more comfortable on a rooftop where there's 4 feet instead of 3 feet. And on top of that, some rooftops you can get some overhang from the structural wall, and you really want that first attachment point. It's assuming that it's going into the structure. So there's more than one reason to even be more conservative with this. If you're in a very strict area where the inspector is going to get up on that roof with his measuring tape and measure 3 feet and tell you, no, you got to take a panel off if you don't hit it, then you don't want to design right up to 3 feet anyway. And again, if you have a roof cap system that might down the road need some maintenance and servicing, going all the way up to the very top of the roof isn't the best idea. anyway. So particularly when you're just getting, and there's ways around these offset requirements. There's building code that requires these offsets, gives you exceptions. Like if you put a forced air ventilation system, which I'm assuming would have to have some sort of emergency power backup, that forced air ventilation system can give you the flexibility and the eyes of code to go all the way to the edge. So there's workarounds and exceptions. If it's aesthetically pleasing and you're going for a higher end project that you just want the look right and you want solar to be on the roof, and for aesthetic reasons you want it to cover the whole roof, you can do that. But if you're designing the array for long-term maintenance, giving yourself room to work up on the rooftop is important. Commercial buildings have offset requirements as well. In fact, for commercial, these requirements are all the more important. One of the top causes of fires in the solar industry is commercial rooftops where the array, and in particular the conduit run, is very long. And so code is preventing the rails from getting too long when they say every 150 feet you need a 6-foot wide walkway. No, it's every 100 feet. It's 6 feet away from the edges of the roof. The actual walkway itself, it has to be 8 feet, with some exceptions that are not very fun exceptions. So every 150 feet, you need an 8-foot walkway. You got to stay 6 feet off the edges of the roof. Yeah, I was doing a commercial project, and the array was supposed to start exactly 6 feet from the edge of the roof. And per OSHA and the prime contractor's OSHA inspector, he says, if y'all are, you need to set up your perimeter with your flags, and if you're outside that perimeter working, 6 feet from the edge, you need to have your full protection on. It's like, you know what? It would have saved us a whole lot if we could have started the array, 8 feet from the edge of the roof instead of 6. So as a designer, I'd say just don't push every single constraint in the name of filling up all the space possible. While in general you want to fill up all the available space, there's some nuance in circuit design, circuit layout, racking layout, ease of installation and servicing that should also be considered, particularly if you're going for a lower cost-effective project budget. And so, the other thing to know is slanted commercial rooftops, which don't have workers on them, for service and maintenance, generally will follow the residential guidelines of the 3-foot offsets, whereas commercial flat roofs and sometimes residential flat roofs as well will have much more stringent setback requirements, 6 feet from the wall, 4 feet from electrical equipment, for servicing purposes and for safety reasons. And so that can severely restrict the use of, like a Philadelphia row home with 10 by 10 feet of available space on the rooftop. Might not really be a good solar site in the eyes of code. And that's why they don't have other equipment up there to begin with. But the name of the solar design game is how many rectangles can you fit onto the rooftop, taking the time to try and do it in a aesthetically pleasing manner. Let me go to some questions. What is the average square foot weight of the panels, track, wiring, electronics, and anchors on the rooftop? It's about 3 pounds a square foot. And we'll show you some racking software probably tomorrow that will calculate that for you. how many 60 cell panels would be required for a 2,800 square foot residence with typical power requirements? So there's two things you can do for that. One is, just look at the rooftop and determine how many panels can you fit on the roof, and then a good project size. When we did this project, it's okay. Well, first, this is the best roof surface, so we're going to use that first, and then there were some roof obstructions here and here, but we still had electric bill and we still had budget left over to do the east and the west surface. And if we still had electric bill and budget, maybe we would have looked at the north side of this rooftop. But at that point, we had we had already hit our project goals on at least one of those items. For a 2,800 square foot home, obviously it's going to have different electric bills, but on a 3,000 square foot home, depending on the region, depending on if it's all electric or not, let's just assume it's using 15,000 kilowatt hours of electricity a year. And if we know in our area, our magic number, let's say you're not in Biloxi where I'm at 1 to 1.5. Let's say you're further north and you're at 1 to 1.3. So 1 watt produces 1.3 kilowatt hours of electricity a year. And at that point, what I know is I need about a 12 kilowatt solar array to offset 100% of its electric bill. Yeah, so the next question is, will we be getting in now to estimate annual power use for new construction where there's no utility bill to use yet as a reference? Well, hopefully there's an old utility bill from an older building so that you can know, at least use that as a starting point. It's very hard to blindly guess electric bills. There's load calculators for that. What I would say is at the residential level, there is really no harm in new construction in doing a little bit of oversizing. And then at the commercial level, you're not doing a solar array to do the whole electric bill anyway. With commercial, you're really going after peak load. And so for residential, if you're looking at array sizes of 12 kilowatts for 3,000 square foot homes, I'd say that's good enough. But again, that's where, for off-grid residential, I'm usually around 20 kilowatts. And then there's certainly, when you get into larger residential luxury homes, 20 kilowatts grid tied is a starting point, and they can even go more than that. A 200 amp residential electric service panel is rated for 50 kilowatts of power. It's just not used all the time. So, residential size solar arrays, residential size battery systems, for the amount of electricity that we use, are in the 12 kilowatt range on up. And in fact, it gets more nuanced when you get into off-grid residential, because instantaneous electric loads of homes can be 30 to 40 kilowatts and still be well within the limits of a 200 amp service panel. So you have a lot more you have to learn that's site specific. So at that point, you have to go and find a NABCEP installer in your area who has more experience with your local market in terms of electric use and homes. Not that I can size it up for you, but you'd have to know a little bit more about what's inside the home. Here's another thing that's interesting with economics. We're not going to spend much time on it, but seasonal electric rates. Electric pricing often goes up in the summertime and down in the wintertime, and so that can impact your economics. And so the takeaway is south for value, west for evening production, east for good morning production, and then north being sometimes acceptable. That's That's the big takeaway with the north side of the roof. It's not that it's always acceptable. South is always acceptable. I think east and west are usually acceptable. North facing, the surprise is that it's sometimes acceptable, not that it's always, just sometimes. A flat solar panel will give you more production in the summertime. We already talked about these things. Economies of scale is a little bit of a bugger. There are many instances where a larger solar project is going to be more cost effective than a smaller one. So in this example, it's basically there's this tree on the side of the building, and after a thorough shade analysis, we actually determined that this array right here got shaded, as much as the north side of the rooftop, and the best design would be to stick the array further away from the tree. So that shouldn't be surprising there. But then it's like, okay, well, this is just one tree. So the client can chop the tree down, proceed with the array as built. And so at which point you're faced with the question, is it more cost effective to do the small solar array on the south side of the building versus the total larger project? Sometimes the total larger project can be the more cost-effective one. Not always, but scale is usually better until you get into a market where you have a bad buyback rate. And if you don't have a very good buyback rate, the flip side can be true. Sometimes a smaller array would be better. So let's talk about some mounting components. First off, there's racking components for almost every roof surface. And this industry, when I got into the industry, there was not a integrated flashed standoff. So the old-fashioned way would be to lag screw into the roof and goop the heck out of it. It's not a very good practice. Now we get these really awesome flashed standoffs that slide underneath the shingle, and the lag screw goes through it, but the actual hole is up underneath. And this is an arduous process. You got to get a pry bar and pry up the nails underneath the shingles, and it's not a perfect process either, because the shingle companies don't want you to do this, and there's some will out, some won't. It's good to check. Most don't check. The most important thing when you're putting a solar array on a shingle rooftop is to respect the fact that every step you take on that roof is getting grit off of the shingles. And so the least amount of time you spend on the rooftop, the best, which means you want to prepare as much as you can do on the ground before getting up on the roof. But for tile roofs, there's a tile replacement. There are kick-up legs you can get. The Spanish tile roof hooks like this that kind of snake out and through the Spanish tile are largely being replaced now with full tile replacement. Once you have your flashed attachment, there is a what's called an L foot, because it's shaped like an L, that gets bolted, lag screwed through the flashing, and then there's a side channel in the rail for the L foot to attach to. At that point, you have a rail, and there's custom clamps, and they all do the same thing. There's slight nuances from manufacturer A to manufacturer B, but there's end clamps that go at the end of the rack, and then there's mid clamps that go between two solar panels. So this is a mid clamp. So here's kind of a completed product where you have this technique. This is where like pro residential solar installers eventually get to, because what you have here is spacing requirements that are within the parameter of the rack. I'll show you how to do that tomorrow. But then we also have the installer recognizes that the rafters, this might be a 4-foot span between point A and point B, but the rafters might be 16 inches apart, so if we just stuck to the 4-foot span, we would be skipping rafters. And so what this installer has done is staggered the rafters so that they're hitting every rafter as they go across the rooftop. And so when I do multiple rows of modules, that's when you can start spacing out the attachments in the interior of the array to the span that the racking system can take. Otherwise, at the corners of the array, along the bottom row, along the top row where you have higher wind, the more conservative attachment foot spacing is 4 feet. Some of this rack can take an 8-foot spacing, but it's best to be conservative. This is showing a 4-foot on center staggered layout with additional reinforcement at the corners. And there's smaller stuff that maybe you would only pick up in the field, but the nuances from racking company A to racking company B is in the cable management. Some cable management systems, the rail goes along the side in a side channel and then gets tie wrapped to the rail, and I don't think that's very elegant. I like racking systems that have this open U channel for the conductors to go into that gives them more protection against squirrels and critters without actually installing a squirrel guard or a critter guard. This is our first picture of something we'll get to tomorrow, which is a module level panel electronics DC optimizer that gets mounted behind every panel on the rooftop. And so when I'm down on the ground, I'm like building these rails and spacing out the optimizers into sections so that we can then lift them up to the rooftop, and that reduces having to build this stuff on the roof. Some installers say that's overkill, but I like very quick up and back down installs. I'd rather spend more time on the ground than less time on the roof. There's cable management, zip ties, little metal cable clips. What's funny is that the zip tie and the cable clip serve two distinct purposes to a solar installer. A cable clip is something that is a good enough clip, but sometimes the cables can jerk out of it. And so, the cable clips are for modules that kind of move but need to be tucked up under, whereas the zip ties are more of a permanent secure thing. So if you need the cable to never move ever again, or to bundle up cables together, the zip tie is more of a permanent attachment. And then cable management becomes a pretty big ordeal. Installers all have their special, how do I wire up these behind the panel DC optimizers to the solar panel, and the optimizers have slack in the cable and the solar panels have slack in the cable, and all of that needs to be managed. Most solar installers will just kind of lay the cable in a bundle on top of everything like that. What I do is I take my optimizer box and I space it out. I put it underneath the next module over, and that takes a lot of slack out, and then I shove it into the rail. And so aside from this flex conduit, it probably could have been a little bit better done, but you can see underneath this module, you got the optimizer here and all the extra slack kind of going up and into this rail channel before it comes out the array and goes back to the point of interconnection. Some other module accessories. If you have trees near your roof, you will want to put a squirrel guard around the array. These become, or pigeons, these become nesting areas, and inevitably that leads to rodent damage. Here we have little clips that are designed for areas of heavy snow, where the concern is not the weight of the snow on the roof or the fact that there's snow on the roof, it's how the snow gets off of the roof. And so to prevent avalanches, they put a little bit of friction into the rack so that the snow sheds more evenly. Purlins, like when the rail runs across the roof, like picture, generally you mount in portrait, not landscape. When the rail runs up the roof, generally you mount in landscape, not portrait. It becomes a little more complicated if you're trying to do, like a combination of shared rail, or when you have purlins running across, but you want to mount in, you want the rail to run across the roof in the same direction of the purlins. Generally, you don't do that. Generally, you'll run the rail perpendicular to the support beam. Just a little more detail on how the racking gets put together. You can do a few things to identify rafter locations. A common one is to take a rubber mallet and bang the roof with the rubber mallet and kind of hear where it hits or not. Ahead of that, you'll go into the roof with a tape measure and you'll measure out the rafter spacing and figure out what it is, and also figure out if it's regular or not. And that can assist the hammer tap. Eventually, you drill a pilot hole into the rooftop with a small drill bit, and that'll tell you if you hit the rafter or if you just went through the decking. But if you're bad at your job and you don't hit the rafter and you go straight through and the rafter's over here, there's a little wire tool that you can put down to see how close you are, and then you adjust it and drill the new hole. With that old hole, you then insert sealant, and then that hole gets covered up by the flashing, which has additional sealant around it. So, poking a hole in the roof, provided that you have a good, solid game plan for flashing around it, is not a big deal. Without the flashing, you don't want to make a mistake. You want it to grab on tight, otherwise it's not going to hold. But by far and away, the industry standard now is to have a flashed standoff on a shingle rooftop. Metal rooftops that aren't standing seam have screws that go directly through the roofing metal. And while it's kind of hard to see, there's this industrial sticky tack that goes around that penetration. I actually like this better than the standing seam solution. And the reason is, as the installer, I can feel the lag screws biting in to those purlins, and I know it's a solid connection, whereas with the standing seam, I have to rely on the strength of how the metal panel is attached to the rooftop. And so in terms of pull strength, this is going through the roof with a hole and a penetration is actually stronger than just clipping to the rooftop. And there's also conduit accessories that are made now to help manage cable runs across rooftops when you're outside the array perimeter, for example. We're approaching the end of our program, and this is actually a program revision. And it's the first time I've taught it, so I fear that I'm a little bit behind on the quiz So I'm pulling that up, but now is a good time to throw out any additional questions, burning questions. Don't wait until tomorrow. Ask them now, so that we'll be sure to get to them. And then tomorrow, when we get back, we will just pick right back up in the lecture. So let's see. In estimating the power use for new construction where there's no utility bill, you just have to go off of building averages and construction averages. If that's, there's on the government website, the EIA has building age, building square footage, building location, building use to help you hone in on that. Or you could start from the electric service panel and calculating hourly loads during a proper energy estimate. I'm going to go through some quiz questions that we didn't get to this in this program. I don't think I ever explained that a watt is instant, whereas energy is a watt hour. There's a time component to it. So a watt is a measurement of power. Yeah, there's a question. Has hail damage, have you ever seen microfractures appear without any damage to the glass? The answer is yes. That's the scary part, is the microfractures absolutely can occur without damage to the glass. So, and you can't even, if snail trails appear on your module, that's only one kind of microfracture. And again, that may or may not be the installer's fault. It could easily be the build quality of the module just as much as it could easily be the installer's fault. So at that point, it really comes down to who you used as the distributor for honoring the warranty. If you have to jump out right now, you will get emailed the quiz. But I'm going to keep going to make sure I got all this other stuff. Okay, here's one question. Supply side interconnections are made at which point on the electric service panel? The supply is the utility side. So we're going to have to get to that tomorrow, but that's opposed to the load side. The load side of your panel is the customer side. The supply side is the utility side. Net metering is any of the above. There's a variety of net metering policies, so they could be different from customer A to customer B. And then DC optimizers are the same as microinverters. Microinverters have a high upfront cost. So the disadvantage of microinverters is that they have a high upfront cost. Otherwise, they're good like DC optimizers, and we'll talk about what that means tomorrow. Let's see. The average sunlight across the country is 1 to 1.5 kilowatt hours per year. If there's a single string of solar modules that is broken, the problem is probably in the connector between the array and the components. Component failure is rare. Workmanship and installer error is common. So it's going to be in the field-made component. It's going to be in the MC4 home run connector. And then the other thing we didn't get into is load side connections can accommodate 120% of the service panel's amperage rating. So there's a special rule we'll get into tomorrow that if you have a 200 amp service, you can add 40 amps of solar to give you 120% total. So hopefully you stuck around to the end and you caught all that. Otherwise, you might find the quiz today a tad challenging. Hopefully we'll get you up to 100% tomorrow. With that, we're out of time, and I'm going to pass it back to Half Moon.
All right. Thanks very much, JR. That was a great start to the program. Lots of great information. And also thank you, everybody, for attending this first section. And thanks for all the questions. Like JR said, your quiz will be sent to your email here shortly. Once you've successfully completed that, you'll have access to your certificate. If you don't pass the quiz right away, you will actually be able to retake it until you do receive a passing grade. With that being said, we'll be reconvening tomorrow at the same time, which is 11 a.m. Central Time. If you have any other questions at all, please feel free to email me and I'll be glad to help. Again, thank you all for being here and see you tomorrow.